that moment when the crate arrived at AM&H, there was this infectious excitement that Lonesome George had arrived safely. It's all so surreal. I don't think it's really sunk it in yet. I just kept thinking, this is a creature that is a symbol of conservation, and we were going to be able to make this piece of taxidermy that will immortalize him.
Lonesome George was a giant tortoise found in the Galapagos, and he was the last known member of the giant tortoises that were from the Pinta Island. He was brought into captivity in 1972 in the Galapagos, and people kept looking and looking and looking. They looked both within the Galapagos as well as in the collections of tortoises that are in zoos around the world, and they never found another individual that was a full Pinta giant tortoise. It's unusual for humans to preside over the demise of an entire species. Generally, the last individual of a species goes extinct in the wild. You don't know it. It's not an individual that people have had a long engagement with over decades. As a scientific community, we had hoped that there was more time with Lonesome George as we were thinking about other ways to try to get him to produce offspring. He never really found much interest in the females that were brought in to be attractive to him. The individuals who took care of him on Santa Cruz in the Tortoise Breeding Center were his keepers for decades. And when he died in June of 2012, they were devastated.
For biologists, Galapagos is sort of the mecca of biology and evolution, in part because it was such an important part of Darwin developing the theory of evolution by natural selection. The reason he was able to do that was because of the uniqueness of species on different islands. For example, tortoises arrived on the most southeastern island first from the continent a few million years ago, and then eventually dispersed to other islands. Well, once they get to another island, they don't go back. So then they evolve again, and this happened with birds, it happened with lizards, geckos, etc. And so what you end up with is many islands have unique species that are only on that one island. And this is what helped Darwin to understand that each island was different. Luckily, because they were isolated for so long and then became a national park of Ecuador in 1959, there was time to make sure that that uniqueness of islands is maintained.
Giant tortoises are the real icons of Galapagos. In fact, the name Galapagos is an old Spanish word for tortoise. They're on many islands in the Galapagos, and they reached astounding numbers. Like the estimate may be 200,000, but we've plummeted to 20,000 animals now, so 10% of their original numbers. How did that happen? It really was a function of whalers. The Galapagos really sustained the sperm whale industry in the days of sailing ships, when a trip to the Pacific from Nantucket or Long Island was a trip around Cape Horn. People would arrive in the whaling grounds basically starving, and they turned to giant tortoises. They had a special word, turpining, for it. We can account for tens of thousands in the logs of sailing ships. They methodically stripped one island after the next, especially the low arid areas. That was the big hit to giant tortoises, but there's still 20,000 giant tortoises in Galapagos, which is remarkable.
The American Museum of Natural History was chosen by the Galapagos and by the government of Ecuador to prepare this individual specimen because we're world-renowned in our taxidermy and our ability to create amazing lifelike forms.
Carl Akeley was a great preparator, photographer, a visionary when it came to our exhibitions. And of course, the Akeley Hall of African mammals as one of the world's great museum halls and one of the world's most beautiful halls. Very often, taxidermy does not just include stuffing the original skin with material, but actually building the mount and reproducing the musculature and the shape and the form, like those wonderful elephants in the Akeley Hall, that's required to give that animal reality.
I remember distinctly my parents taking me to the Museum of Natural History for the first time and just completely being enamored with the exhibits there. Seeing the dioramas, seeing this taxidermy in this grand display, I was completely sold. I loved not only the taxidermy, but the exhibits. The fact that these dioramas were this window to the natural world.
Taxidermy for museum exhibitry is, of course, extraordinarily important because it brings these animals to life. George Dante collaborates with the museum on a number of projects, and most recently, he worked on our wonderful Bernard Family Hall of North American Mammals. His work is both scientifically accurate and beautiful.
One of the challenges we face working on the taxidermy is how do we decide the most effective pose? Not only is this specimen the last known individual of its species, but people know Lonesome George. So we need to think about what was Lonesome George's pose, and not just what is the pose that is characteristic of this species.
In the case of Lonesome George, you have this wonderful, beautiful long neck and relatively long limbs and this unusual shaped shell called a saddleback shell, which allows the neck to actually extend higher, which some people have suggested might even help tortoises graze at higher level.
Everyone knows a tortoise as just being this ground-dwelling creature, so low to the ground, very sloth-like, and then all of a sudden this creature just rises up on his legs, and it's just this amazing moment.
We really wanted to have a pose that will capture George in an animated, moving posture, and by actually also having his head up nice and high, it sort of demonstrates the reach that he could achieve with his neck. If you look at the photographs of George when he's in these types of postures, he looks absolutely fantastic.
Okay, now that second hump. We've prepared tortoises before, but nothing quite this large. Because of their availability, no one has really mounted many of these specimens in contemporary times. We needed as many photographs as we could. We needed to get as many sketches as we could and as many casts as we could, because once we start the taxidermy process, there's no turning back. Once we make the cast of a foot, then make an incision and start to remove the skin, we'll never be able to get that cast again. So it's extremely important that these casts are here for our reference, because it gives us that point that we can refer back to. Once I started creating a mannequin, I had the pose the way I wanted, and there's that critical point where now I need the input from the scientific department. Essentially, when I sculpt this in clay, the clay will start right up here.
No.
Oh, okay.
So you have two tendons right here.
Okay. Our first scientific review with Darryl Frost was to look at the basic pose we had, look at some issues I was having with the back legs, and basically tell us if the neck was in the correct position. And these minor adjustments were essential in capturing the pose we were looking for and also keeping it scientifically accurate. Akeley's method is still the definitive method of taxidermy, even by today's standards. The Akeley method of taxidermy is the rearticulating of the animal's skeleton and then creating a very elaborate clay sculpture over the top of the skeleton. All the muscles would be in place, every wrinkle, every detail. So when he was complete, you have this beautiful clay sculpture of this animal, minus its skin. He would then take the clay sculpture, mold it and cast it, and then out of the plaster molds, he would make a papier-mâché mannequin. For George, now we alter it a bit. We make casts of his legs and use those casts in place of the skeleton. The first thing I want to conquer is to make sure the anatomy is as good as it can be, really capturing the muscle tone and the shapes. And the next step would be to recreate the wrinkles, which are really characteristic of George. And I think we'll have the curators look at it again at that point. As you're creating a piece that you're trying to make scientifically accurate, there's a point where the artist takes over and you want to just fix things and make it a little bit flamboyant and add an extra hand of the artist in there. The scientist has to hold back and keep in check what's completely accurate.
With the skin, have you actually checked to see whether this neck length is looks like it's correct now?
Yes, I think it's a struggle at times.
It looks like poor old George here is getting a little flabby.
Yes.
Under here.
Yes.
I think that he was a little trimmer than that.
But I think there's a point where the two come together and just mesh perfectly.
But these feet positions now are perfect. I wouldn't change those at all. It's very, very satisfying now to actually come here and say, wow, that just looks perfect. That is exactly the posture that we've been discussing and agonizing about for months. The other side of things, this is also a great chance to then start thinking about the subtle things that we're now starting to discuss in detail, like, for example, what exactly would the color of Lonesome George's eyes have been?
Trying to find a reference photo of a Galapagos tortoise's eye proved to be a very difficult challenge. Their eyes are very small, and because of the light the photos are usually taken under, the eye always gets shadowed out. We were very lucky. The Turtleback Zoo was very kind to let us go into their enclosure and work with their tortoises and collect reference photos.
There's that blue eye.
Yeah, absolutely. Our glass company that we work very closely with is actually custom making his eyes. They cast a piece of crystal and also custom paint the eye specifically for him. He did one with a larger iris, one with a smaller iris, depending on what we were looking for. I think these are the first Galapagos tortoise eyes ever made, because normally people would just use a bird eye or a hollow bubble. Perfect. Perfect. The first time we test fit the skin on the sculpture, there's a great amount of frustration because we know we're in the beginning stages. Sure is a lot of slack in there still. Every fitting from there, we see it start to take shape. We start to add little bits of clay, and little by little, this sculpture just evolves into this grand anatomy of this animal. The skin will actually tell you where some of the folds are. That is the beauty of taxidermy, is that the skin itself will lay over this form and you'll be able to see subtle creases and lines where the skin wants to go. And this is actually Pinta Island soil. And this is actually the color that we're looking for to get into all these little details, all the little cracks and crevices of his skin between all the scales. And you could see the amount of soil and dust that these tortoises accumulate. What I'm trying to do is find a color that's going to match that Pinta Island soil. You study wildlife and you look at it from afar and you always have all these questions, and now you're holding the specimen in your hand. I guess as many naturalists feel when they collect a specimen, the answers start to flow. I think it's difficult for an artist not to get emotionally involved with a project. And with a project such as George, you have this incredible specimen, you have this amazing personality, you have this amazing piece of conservation and history. Not to get emotionally attached to this, it just wasn't going to happen.
He's really come out so well. There's that real sense of movement. It's so important that we have the opportunity to conserve him so that people can actually experience him. If you think about other species that have gone extinct like the dodo, the fact that there are no intact specimens anywhere, whatever you see in a museum is an artificial recreation, it's a model. But here we have the whole Lonesome George. This is his shell, his skin. You feel like you're standing right next to a living, live giant tortoise.
The measure of the success is going to happen in several stages. One, we have to make sure the scientific department at AMNH is completely satisfied with the accuracy of this piece. Then we have the people of Galapagos, the people that knew George. They have to be 100% satisfied that not only is it the greatest Galapagos tortoise taxidermy, but it's also George.
When I walked into that exhibit, I really was very touched and close to tears. He captured the spirit of George.
Tortoises have tremendous personalities. I mean, Lonesome George being a classic example. He was a very curious individual. I love the way he's actually prepared now because it's a mixture of sort of bravado and curiosity. But if you look at his tail, it's just tucked up tightly. He's a little timid at the same time. People have a tremendous affinity toward tortoises and turtles. It's been actually shown in quantitative surveys of preferences of different kinds of animals. We can really relate to the shell and having to go inside it, and we all sort of feel like turtles in different parts of our lives, but there was something about our affinity toward a turtle and Lonesome George being the last known member of his species that really triggered a lot of emotion. Really, it begs the question, these things do matter. Extinction really does matter. For example, on Pinta Island, it needs tortoises. Tortoises are not just unusual, fascinating creatures, but they're ecological engineers. I recently calculated they probably eat on the order of 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of vegetation per year. And if on Pinta we think maybe there were 10,000 giant tortoises at one point, it's a huge ecological force that's no longer present. I think George is a really good example of it does matter.
There used to be giant tortoises across the world, and now there are only two different groups left, one of them in the Galapagos and the other one in Aldabra. Unfortunately, all of the giant tortoises in the Galapagos are at risk of extinction. We used to consider them as all one or a couple of species, and now that we're more aware that there are a number of species, we need to maintain them as separate species and ensure that we manage them as distinct units into the future.
The Galapagos National Park Directorate has taken the lead in preserving the very fragile species that exist on land and also in the ocean. We're trying to think on the dynamics and the importance of giant tortoises roaming an island that once had a big population.
There's 4 extinct populations of tortoises. One we think went extinct due to volcanism, but the others due to human exploitation of tortoises. So on those islands, we really want to return populations, and it just so happens that the genetic group at Yale University found hybrid tortoises on Wolf Volcano at the northern end of Isabella Island. And it turns out whalers 200 years ago dropped some tortoises off there. I guess their boats were overfull or something. So they have found hybrids with partial ancestry from these populations that are now extinct. They will come to the Park Service Tortoise Center on Santa Cruz, breed in captivity. The young will be returned to Floriana or Pinta, depending on the parents, and we will rebuild those populations with genes from the original tortoises. They won't be pure, but they'll be the closest that we can do today. And as I often say, next 200,000 years, we'll have a Pinta tortoise and we'll have a Floriana tortoise.
1, 2, 3, pull.
Lonesome George deserves to be seen. He's a great opportunity to make people think about how we share our environment. He's the animal that brings all these different thoughts about evolution, about conservation, about human behavior to the whole planet.